Hello. In this presentation, you're going to be learning about traditional plot structure. The word traditional is key here because what we're talking about is the format that most stories will follow. Even those that attempt to be creative with the structure of a story will inevitably contain these particular parts that we're going to look at today. Okay? So if you'd like to print out the PDF that says diagram for note taking, please feel free to do that prior to beginning this lecture. You can also print out an additional copy if you think it's helpful to plot out your own short story that you're working on for the course and use that in any way that might help you plot specific pieces of action or conflict throughout your story. Okay? All right, the first element that we need to make sure you understand is called the exposition. In this, and think of the word expose here. The writer will be exposing, or filmmaker, if we're talking about a film, who the characters are, what's the setting. We're going to get a sense probably right away for the mood or tone of the particular story. And there's a whole list of words that can be used to describe the tone or mood, or atmosphere is another good word to know there for the tone or mood of a story. We're probably going to be introduced to the main character and maybe even some of the minor characters at this point, potentially even the antagonist. It just depends on how quickly the writer wants to move into the story, or if it's a very short story, that certainly affects when we're introduced to certain characters. So that is what in general is called the exposition. Right away, once it's been established who the protagonist is within a character, we have to have conflict. Without conflict, we have no story. We'll be talking throughout this lesson also about the types of conflict that you can choose to introduce to your main character. But we're not going to get into that at this point. But you have to have some sort of conflict introduced for the main character. I call this the 3 Ps. The protagonist is presented a problem, and it's just an easy way to remember. I've positioned it here on our traditional plot diagram because it generally needs to happen fairly quickly. You've probably read novels or stories or seen films where you felt like maybe it lagged a little bit to get to the initial conflict, or it was unclear even what the particular problem or main problem was that the character was going to solve. Now, keep in mind that a character can have multiple problems, but there's generally one essential critical problem or conflict that the character is going to be confronted with. On this part of the diagram, the protagonist is going to solve the problem, and he or she will not solve the problem in this part of the traditional plot structure. In fact, this will be rife with failure. So all of the attempts the protagonist tries to make here to solve the initial conflict or the main conflict will fail. Again, if you think about books you've read or stories or films you've seen, there's kind of a sweet spot here, and there's really no set formula for how many tries the protagonist should have. But there certainly is, I think, an element to this storytelling that is sort of an X factor. I don't know how many is too many or how many is not enough, but I do know when I read a story or see a film and I feel that the protagonist has won over the problem too quickly, I don't feel that maybe he or she has earned whatever's at the other side here. Likewise, there have been times I thought, oh my goodness, please, let's get this solved. This has gone on for so long. So there's definitely storytellers who just have a knack for getting that part right. Just enough agony, I think, for the protagonist that we feel the outcomes are realistic. But you definitely can have too few or too many of those tries. And that's a skill that I think many writers have to work to develop. Through this process of attempt and fail, the protagonist is probably going to reach what I like to call the crisis point. This is a true low point, and probably almost a breaking point for the protagonist. he or she may express to a minor character or in internal thoughts that he or she wants to quit, give up. I can't take it anymore. I can't go on. Something. In some stories, particularly an adventure sort of story, the main character may even appear to die emotionally or literally, depending on the type of story. But there's going to usually be something that rallies that protagonist on to keep going forward and continue with this effort to conquer the problem, whatever it may be. Because there's such an enormous amount of tension and struggle in this part of the traditional plot structure, that's why this is called, typically called the rising action, the left side of the plot structure. What is it, though, that's rising? It's action, it's tension, it's difficulty, it's struggle, and it continues to build and build and build to that crisis point where the protagonist, it may appear, can't go forward, has lost the will to go forward, or whatever it may be. And then this is called the crisis point or the turning point of a story. And this is really best defined as the moment that the initial problem that was introduced here, the main one, okay, is going to be solved one way or the other. Success, failure of sorts, I'll explain more about that in a moment, or something, but that problem is not going to exist anymore after this point. It doesn't mean there may not be new problems awaiting, but this initial problem, the main one, the main conflict, will be solved at this point in the story. And that's why it's called the turning point, because for the protagonist, that particular conflict will no longer exist at that point in the story. This side of the plot structure is called the denouement. This is a French word. I keep skipping ahead here and I apologize. This is called the denouement, and it means the working out. This is essentially where all loose ends caused by the conflict will be neatly tied up. We shouldn't be left with lingering questions about this particular problem. And I want to stress that. Because sometimes students will always ask me, well, what about those cliffhanger movies or stories where it's clear there's going to be a sequel? And that's a very good point. However, what I would stress is that story, whatever is the protagonist getting ready to embark upon, will not include this particular conflict. So that's the key thing, is that once you establish what that conflict's going to be, this traditional plot structure should lead the reader or the viewer through something a pattern that they can recognize and follow. Even stories that like to toy with this structure, for example, by using flashback. Maybe you begin somewhere over here where we get a glimpse of the neatly tied up conflict that we haven't even been introduced to yet. And certainly filmmakers and storytellers do that all the time. Use elements of flashback or some kind of a chopped up structure. But eventually, if all the pieces are put together, you should see all of these parts in any good story, even if the storyteller or filmmaker is attempting to do something creative with that traditional structure. I always draw this side of the plot structure shorter, because in a film, even in a book, that portion is shorter. In some stories, it's a single sentence. In some stories, it's the last paragraph. In a film, this may be a single shot in the film itself, one screen that points to an ending or things being tied up. Compared to the struggle that happened here, this is always a much shorter portion of the story. So I do not draw them equally because I like to indicate that it's shorter. All right, and this is the slide I kept trying to get to before. This is called the the whole side of this structure is called the falling action, and that is because the tension no longer exists. We've gotten past that main conflict, and everything is dropping. The tension drops or falls, and that's why it's called the falling action. And we're just simply being shown how the story is going to wrap up or make sense in total. And then finally, you have the resolution. All that means is it should be clear that the protagonist is going to move on with his or her life without the conflict that was established at the beginning of the story. That particular conflict will not exist in the future for that character. Now, you might be thinking, well, what if my main character dies somehow, probably at the climactic moment of meeting an opposition? Well, what typically you're going to see here in the denouement and the resolution is the fruit of that sacrifice. If your protagonist sacrifices or is sacrificed in some way in the story, it may point to a future that demonstrates, for example, the benefit of that sacrifice. I mean, depending, you know, on what the writer or the filmmaker is going for. Certainly, there are many, many stories that do not have what we would call a happy ending. But often, if you kill off your protagonist in the story for whatever reason, something here, if you want people to feel good at the end of the story, it should point to some sort of result that's meaningful or that will bring value to the lives of others. Okay. So that depends on, you know, of course, your overall theme or essential question that you're dealing with. And it may be that you do not want to, you know, provide that kind of an ending. So again, there's always room for imagination and creativity here. All right, so if you wanted to kind of test yourself and see if you haven't done this traditional plot structure before, and see if you can do this without looking at the notes or looking back at the presentation, that might be an interesting way to test yourself. And there's the answers. Okay, so you'll have that if you want to test yourself when you're done. All right, thank you for your attention through this presentation, and hopefully you'll be able to apply some of these concepts to your own fiction writing. Thank you.